Welcome to Grandma's Tales. Today, we have a beautiful bedtime story for toddlers, preschoolers, and anyone who loves a quiet journey into a miniature world. Find your coziest blanket, let your shoulders relax, and let the gentle rhythm of my voice guide you into a state of perfect rest. Have you ever wondered what happens in the quietest corners of a playroom when the sun goes down, the lights are turned off, and the big world falls fast asleep? Tonight, we are going to look beneath the floorboards and inside a beautiful, still toy house to discover a secret that happened long ago. This story will lead us to a tiny, peaceful place where mistakes are softly mended and where responsibility brings the sweetest, quietest dreams. For parents and children alike, this journey is a safe harbour where sleep comes easily, drifting in like a warm, golden mist. Our story takes place in a large, comfortable nursery where a grandfather clock stands against the wall. The clock regulates the entire room with its steady, rhythmic pulse. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It is a slow, grounding sound that reminds everyone it is time to slow down. In the middle of this room stands a magnificent dollhouse, painted in soft cream and gentle crimson, with real muslin curtains hanging in the tiny windows. This beautiful dollhouse belongs to two elegant dolls named Lucinda and Jane. Lucinda is the lady of the house, always dressed in a beautiful, stiff velvet gown, sitting quietly in the parlour. Jane is the cook, wearing a neat white apron, permanently stationed in the miniature kitchen. The house is a masterpiece of small wonders, filled with tiny wooden chairs, a soft velvet sofa, and a dining table that is always set for a magnificent feast. On the dining table sits a dinner that never spoils. There is a beautifully glazed ham with pink and white shading, a shiny silver fish on a platter, a tiny loaf of bread, and a glass stand filled with colourful pudding and tarts. Everything looks absolutely delicious, catching the warm, golden light of the nursery fire. But because it is a dollhouse, the food is made entirely of hard, painted plaster. It is beautiful to look at, but it cannot be eaten. Underneath the very same nursery floorboards, near the base of the dollhouse, lived two tiny field mice. Their names were Tom Thumb and Munca. Tom Thumb was a slender, curious little mouse with sleek brown fur and bright, inquisitive eyes. He had a special treasure that he carried with him everywhere, a smooth, crooked silver sixpence that he had found lost under a rug. This coin was his totem, his most prized possession, which he kept polished and bright. Munca was his gentle companion, a tidy and resourceful mouse who loved nothing more than collecting soft bits of moss and stray threads to make their nest under the floorboards cozy and warm. They lived a very quiet life, listening to the grand grandfather clock upstairs. Tick-tock, tick-tock. They knew the routine of the nursery perfectly, waiting for the moments when the room became completely still. One beautiful golden afternoon, a wonderful opportunity arrived for the two curious mice. The little girl who owned the nursery decided to take Lucinda and Jane out for a grand promenade. She carefully placed the two dolls into a tiny doll perambulator, a beautiful miniature carriage with rolling wheels, and pushed them out into the sunny garden. The dollhouse was left completely empty, standing silent in the warm afternoon light. Tom Thumb put his head out of his hole beneath the skirting board. He blinked his bright eyes in the gentle light. The nursery was entirely quiet, save for the faithful ticking of the clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. He turned to Hunca Munca and whispered that the coast was clear. With great care, their tiny paws making no sound at all, the two little mice crept across the soft nursery rug toward the magnificent dollhouse. They climbed up the smooth wooden steps of the porch and peeped through the front door. It was wide open. Tom Thumb, holding his crooked silver sixpence tightly against his furry chest, stepped inside first. Hunca Munca followed closely behind, her whiskers twitching with wonder as she looked at the beautiful miniature rugs and the tiny oil paintings hanging on the cream-coloured walls. They made their way directly to the dining room, drawn by the incredible sight of the feast on the table. Tom Thumb's nose twitched as he looked at the beautifully glazed plaster ham. It looked so real, so shiny, and so inviting. He squeaked softly with excitement, thinking that they had found the most magnificent dinner in the entire world. He jumped onto a tiny wooden chair and reached for the silver knife. Tom Thumb tried to carve the ham, but the knife simply slid off the hard, painted surface. He tried harder, pressing his tiny paws down, but the knife would not bite into the meat. It was as hard as a stone. He handed the knife to Hunca Munca, who tried to cut a tiny slice of the silver fish, but the knife made a sharp, clinking sound against the plaster. There was no smell of food, only the scent of fresh paint and lacquer. The wave of deep frustration overcame Tom Thumb. He had expected a wonderful, soft feast, but instead he found a cold, deceptive illusion. In a moment of impatience, losing his usual gentle manner, he dropped the knife and struck the plaster ham with the heavy, crooked silver sixpence. The force of the blow cracked the beautiful pink glaze, and a small chunk of white plaster broke off, crumbling into dust on the miniature table. Seeing the ham break, a strange, frantic energy took hold of the two little mice. They felt misled by the beautiful house. Tom Thumb dragged the silver fish off its platter and threw it into the middle of the floor. But it did not break. It simply bounced, because it was made of solid plaster. Together, they pulled the tarts and the pudding from the glass stand, scattering the hard painted toys across the tiny dining room rug. When they realized that none of the beautiful food could be eaten, they explored the rest of the house, their curiosity turning into a chaotic search for something useful. They marched into the bedroom upstairs. Tom Thumb pulled the feathers out of Lucinda's bolster, laughing softly as the white down floated through the air like a tiny indoor snowstorm. Hunca Munca admired the small wooden cradle and thought of her own nest beneath the floorboards. With great effort, working together as the grandfather clock ticked away the precious minutes, tick-tock, tick-tock, they began to carry things out of the dollhouse. They carried the soft feather bolster down the steps. They carried a tiny copper kettle from the kitchen, a small brass bird cage, and even the lightweight wooden cradle. All of these treasures were carefully squeezed through the hole in the skirting board into their dark, cosy mouse hole. As the late afternoon shadows lengthened across the nursery, the front door of the big house opened, and the little girl returned from the garden. She pushed the doll perambulator back to its spot beside the dollhouse. She lifted Lucinda and Jane out of the carriage and went to place them back into their home. But when she looked inside, she let out a small gasp of absolute surprise. The dollhouse was in complete disarray. The beautiful plaster ham was cracked, the fish was on the floor, the tarts were scattered, and Lucinda's bedroom was covered in loose feathers. Lucinda sat on her overturned velvet sofa, her painted eyes staring blankly at the mess, while Jane stood by her empty kitchen, lacking her favourite copper kettle. It was a scene of quiet sorrow in the miniature world. The nursery nurse came over to see what had caused the commotion. She shook her head and declared that there must be mice in the nursery. That very evening, she went downstairs and brought back a small, shiny wire mousetrap, baiting it with a piece of real, fragrant toasted cheese. She placed the trap right by the skirting board, near the hole where Tom Thumb and Hunca Munca lived. Meanwhile, inside the dark, quiet space beneath the floorboards, the frantic energy had entirely faded away. Tom Thumb and Hunca Munca sat surrounded by the stolen dollhouse toys. Hunca Munca had placed the tiny cradle in the corner, filling it with the stolen feathers, making a beautiful bed for her future mouse babies. But as they sat in the quiet, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock reached their ears. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The rhythmic sound of the clock brought a deep sense of calm and reflection to Tom Thumb. He looked at his totem, the crooked silver sixpence, which was now smudged with white plaster dust. He looked at the beautiful copper kettle and the brass bird cage. He realized that their outburst of anger had broken the peace of the nursery. They had taken what did not belong to them, and they had damaged a beautiful home out of mere frustration. A feeling of soft regret settled into Tom Thumb's heart. He did not want to be a bad mouse. He wanted to be a good neighbour in the quiet nursery. He looked at the crooked silver sixpence and knew exactly what he had to do. He showed the coin to Hunca Munca, whispering his plan. She nodded gently, her dark eyes reflecting the warm understanding that fixing a mistake is the most beautiful thing a mouse can do. Late that night, when the entire house was wrapped in a deep velvet slumber, and the fire had burned down to glowing red embers, Tom Thumb crept out of the hole. He carefully avoided the wire trap with the toasted cheese. He did not want the cheese anymore. He carried his precious crooked silver sixpence in his mouth, climbing up the steps of the dollhouse once again. He entered the dark dining room, where the cracked ham still sat on the table. He walked upstairs to the bedroom, where Jane's tiny stocking hung from the edge of the wooden bedpost. With great care and tenderness, Tom Thumb dropped the crooked silver sixpence right into the toe of Jane's stocking. It was his payment for the broken ham, a gift of pure goodwill to make amends for his impatience. But they did not stop there. Munca understood that true restoration requires ongoing care and dedication. The very next morning, before the sun had even risen, and while the nursery was still filled with the cool blue shadows of dawn, she took a tiny dustpan and a miniature broom made of twigs that she had crafted herself. She quietly slipped into the dollhouse while Lucinda and Jane were still resting. With soft, rhythmic strokes, she began to sweep the dining room floor. She swept up all the loose plaster dust, putting it into her tiny dustpan. She tidied the tarts, placed the silver fish back onto its platter, and carefully smoothed out the muslin curtains that had been crinkled during their visit. Every single morning, from that day forward, Munca returned to the dollhouse with her little broom. She became the secret, invisible caretaker of the miniature palace. She swept the hearth, dusted the velvet sofa, and made sure that the house was absolutely pristine for Lucinda and Jane. It was her way of bringing harmony back to their shared world. When the little girl and the nurse saw the dollhouse the next day, they were amazed. The dust was gone, the tarts were neatly arranged, and when the nurse lifted Jane, she found the beautiful, crooked silver sixpence inside the tiny stocking. The nurse smiled warmly, realizing that these mice were not destructive pests, but honorable little creatures who cared about their surroundings. The nurse removed the wire mouse trap and never brought it back. Instead, she began to leave a tiny cracker crumb and a small drop of sweet milk near the skirting board every evening. Tom Thumb and Munca had transformed a moment of anger into a lasting bond of quiet friendship and mutual respect between the big world and the small world. Lucinda and Jane sat in their perfectly clean home, looking out of the window with an air of quiet contentment. They knew they had secret helpers who came in the dark to care for them. And Tom Thumb, though he no longer carried his crooked sixpence, felt a profound weight lifted from his heart. He felt lighter, happier, and incredibly peaceful, knowing he had made things right. Now, Beneath the floorboards, the mouse nest was warm, safe, and filled with the gentle rustle of soft feathers. Tom Thumb and Hunca Munca curled up together, their little paws tucked in, their whiskers perfectly still. Upstairs, the grand-grandfather clock continued its ancient, comforting song. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Everything was in its proper place. Everything was safe. Everything was quiet. The lesson of the two little mice is a gentle reminder for all of us as we close our eyes tonight. It reminds us that mistakes can always be mended with kindness, that taking care of our world brings the deepest peace, and that being a good neighbour fills our hearts with warmth. Let that comforting thought wrap around you like a soft velvet cloak. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your breath, perfectly matching the slow rhythm of the ticking clock. The world is safe, your room is warm, and there is nothing more you need to do tonight. The miniature world is asleep, the dolls are at rest, and the little mice are dreaming sweet golden dreams beneath the floorboards. Thank you for listening to Grandma's Tales. For more beautiful, low-stimulation audiobooks for toddlers, preschoolers, or 3-year-olds, stay on our channel, subscribe, and share these quiet moments with other families. Sleep tight, little ones, and may your dreams be filled with magic, responsibility, and the gentlest peace. The end.